All right, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to legislative session for the Guthrie Chamber of Commerce. I'm Tracy, and I appreciate you guys tuning in to hear from Mike Jackson from the State Chamber about the situation that our state finds us in. We're yet in another deficit, so we want to hear about the plans that they have. And I'm going to turn you over to Chris Evans, who is the chair of our legislative committee, and he's going to introduce you to Mike.
Thank you, Tracy.
Put this on so I don't have to worry about it.
You're official.
All right, thank you everybody for being here and to our worldwide audience as well. And we'd like to thank the City of Guthrie for letting us have City Hall. This is sponsored by the State Chamber. Guthrie Chamber of Commerce is hosting the State Chamber, so we appreciate them coming up here and spend some time with us. I'm going to introduce Mike Jackson. He's the Executive Vice President of Government and Political Affairs and Advocacy. Mike joined the State Chamber in 2014 after serving 10 years in the Oklahoma House of Representatives. Jackson served the last 2 years as the Speaker pro tempore of the House and served on all committees. He helped with the development of rules, presided over numerous sessions, and passed many bills that were good for business. Prior to serving in the legislature, Jackson was the Northwest Field Representative for U.S. Senator Jim Inhofe, who has been to Guthrie many, many times, and the Public Information Officer for the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture. Again, we thank you for viewing us, and we're going to turn it over to Mr. Mike Jackson.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. All right, first off, welcome. Thank you for coming out this evening and talking a little bit about what's going on at our state capitol. This is actually, it was talked about that I actually served in the legislature for 10 years. During my tenure, we actually had two special sessions, one in 2005, dealing with workers' compensation, Senate Bill 1X, which was passed. And then in 2013, we dealt with a situation on lawsuit reform, where we dealt with that in 5 days, passing approximately 9 bills to fix that situation. So this is now my third special session since I've been either a elected representative or a lobbyist at the Capitol for the State Chamber. Now that you know a little bit about myself, I want to tell you a little bit about the State Chamber, and then we'll get into the nuts and bolts about what the legislature is actually having to deal with in terms of this budgetary situation, and we'll take a look at 10 years in the past and make sure that we're giving an accurate reflection of how they're having to and what they're having to deal with on a daily basis. So, a little bit about what the Chamber does. We are a voice for public policy issues. We have more than 1,500 members that represent over 350,000 employees in the state of Oklahoma. We connect members to state and federal policymakers. We just got back from Washington, D.C. And we host informative and network events like this one this evening. Some of our strategic partners, we have a state research foundation, and then we also have and they do a lot of research for us on many issues that our members care about. We also have a Chamber Action Network, which we have over 80 members of that network, and Guthrie is one of those partners with us. We have the Oklahoma Civil Justice Council, which actually does a little bit of, is the only independent group that looks at our justice system and actually looks at the decisions that are made by the Supreme Court and Civil Court of Appeals. OEDC, the Oklahoma Economic Development Council, we are actually the managers of that, and those are all of our economic developers across the state. And then the Oklahoma Educated Workforce Initiative, which just recently changed their name to Oklahoma Achieves, and that is the education policy initiative of the State Chamber. Some of the things that we focus on: aerospace, technology. The issues that I actually lobby on behalf of for the Chamber are energy and natural resources, as well as the economic development and taxation and retail. I do those issues. We have 6 lobbyists at the Capitol for the Chamber, and others represent other issues within these things here. So in terms of how we actually make policy, it's our members who actually develop our policy for us. We are about ready to start the committee process, and we bring in all of our members from across the state. Members and staff develop the policy, then the ideas are examined by a legal counsel and staff. Recommendations from specific policy committees go up to the board level, and then in December we actually approve our legislative agenda. Okay, some of the results that we've had in the past few years, and we're just highlighting some of them. Last year, you'll remember at the very beginning, there was a huge effort by the governor, the president pro tem, and the Speaker of the House, as well as others, trying to pass the Real ID Act, at least to bring us into partial compliance. That was done in 2017. Established procedures for public-private partnerships, otherwise known as P3 projects. We did that last year. Amended the State Shale Act to foster drilling. That was Senate Bill 867. We overhauled the students' testing policies in 2016. And then we also got into, and some of the bills that have been introduced during this special session are dealing with tax credits and some of those things. In 2015, we created the Incentive Evaluation Commission. We believe at the Chamber that if they are a good incentive, then they should stand the test of scrutiny. And basically what has happened in the last 2 years is almost all of our incentive programs have been scrutinized by an outside third party to make sure that they are creating jobs, creating investment, and we at the Chamber actually spearheaded that effort. So, what does Oklahoma's budget picture really look like? So let's look back in 2009. This is back whenever I was still in the legislature. But in 2009, the general appropriations bill for the state of Oklahoma was $7.07 billion. That is only the portion at which the legislature has control over. In 2010, if you remember the time frame, in 2010, we saw a significant decrease in not only natural gas prices, but also in the global economy at large. At the same time, that was the same time that the federal government came back in and actually did stimulus dollars at about $1.5 to $2 billion to replace the cuts that we actually put in place in 2010. But Oklahoma was only spending about $6 billion at that point. Then we saw a little bit of an uptick in 2011, 12. We saw a little bit of an uptick. The height was in 2014 and 15, about the time I left office. And then we saw a little bit of a reduction. We saw natural gas and oil prices went down in 2015 and 16. That affected our overall budget. And then we've basically stayed even for the last 3 years. Okay, so what this slide is showing us is exactly what we saw last year. This slide is basically saying the red line is what the legislature, the appropriated portion of what the legislature spends, was versus what the Board of Equalization actually authorized the state of Oklahoma to spend. The gray line, if you look in 2010, the gray line was a little bit over what the legislature spent, but they also supplanted the amount of money in 2010 with the federal stimulus dollars. And then we saw a significant decrease in 2011. And then in the last 2 years, and this is part of the issue, the one-time revenues and the revenue increases that we're starting to see rolled out by the legislature is because of the difference between the gray line, which is what they were authorized to spend, and the top line, which is what the legislature actually spent. So they were authorized to actually spend about $6 billion, but they spent about $6.85 billion in the last 2 legislative sessions. Okay, so why are we in special session? And it's this top one, it's the cigarette smoking cessation fee. The Supreme Court struck down the cessation fee. So we have a budget hole which affects 4 agencies, and those are the Healthcare Authority, the Department of Health, the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse, and the ABLE Commission. Those are the agencies that would be hit the most by what occurred at the Supreme Court. Now, the second one, recurring revenue that occurred in the 2017 regular session, was the vehicle use tax at 1.25. There's an exemption within Title 68. They did not eliminate the exemption in its entirety and did not give the ability to the cities to actually levy that tax, but they did actually increase that up or decrease the exemption from 4.5, which is what the state of Oklahoma taxes, down to 1.25. So we increased gross production tax on wells drilled that were on 1%. So those wells that were still on the old system, if you remember, in 2014 we moved the gross production tax from 1% to 2% if they were horizontally drilled. So those that were still on the 1%, last year they moved those from 1 to 4%. So they were still, because they received that for 48 months. So those that were still receiving that incentive were moved from 1% to 4%. That actually added $97 million to the overall budget. Also, the fee that was assessed for the compliance for Real ID driver's license was estimated at 17%. And we see some other things, including the long lateral drilling, which they expect will actually bring in approximately $7 or $9 million into our state budget. That doesn't include the local sales tax and local activity that's actually occurring. So that is the recurring revenue that was passed in 2017. What else did they do to basically fill that budget hole created by the Board of Equalization? Well, they took a little bit of money out of the roads plan, and you might have heard about it, and it's referred to as the 8-year plan. Started in 2005. There is a cap of $535 million in the roads plan. So they have a significant amount of money put aside to update our roads and our bridges. We've made tremendous progress in that area since 2005. They took $100 million and moved that over to the General Revenue Fund, and that was in the realm of $100 million. Last year, they also used $83 million from the Rainy Day Fund, which was exactly half of what was actually remaining within the Rainy Day Fund. Today, at the legislature, with a bunch of different hurdles, they could actually spend up to $83. Without those hurdles being met, somewhere between $23 and $24 million could be spent in this legislative session to fill the $214 million hole that was created by the decision by the Supreme Court. Agency revolving funds. In the last 7 years, I believe that the legislature has actually looked at agency revolving funds all the way from the Oklahoma Tax Commission to the Department of Public Safety and other agencies who have funds that are set aside for specific purposes. The legislature has basically started to look at those funds and use them in general appropriations purposes. CIRB, and that is the transfer from the County Improvement and Road and Bridge Fund. In 2007, we started the CIRB, which is an additional amount of money that is actually appropriated to the county for their county roads and bridges. Now, there are other set-asides through gross production tax, as well as other set-asides that we'll get into later, because you've probably heard the term off the top, as well as the federal monies, because we'll get into the overall picture. Right now, we're just talking about what the legislature actually has control over. And then we'll go back into questions as we go through the entire program, and hopefully you will have some questions on what the legislature is looking at. But the total amount of money that they looked at in terms of one-time revenue was about $370 million last year in the 2017 budget, or FY18. Okay, how does Oklahoma spend our money? So basically, if you look at it, the blue side is the amount of money that goes to education as a whole. That's about 49% of the overall budget goes to education. 35.8 goes to common education, which is about the total is 3.3 for common education. It is about $2.5 billion goes to common education from the legislature itself, not from the state of Oklahoma, but from the legislature. 1.6 goes to career tech, and about a little over 11% goes to higher ed institutions. Now, we'll get into this a little bit later, but the green portion is healthcare and healthcare-related items. This is significantly rising in the state of Oklahoma. If you look at 10 years back or even 5 years back, the healthcare portion of the budget that's actually appropriated by the legislature continues to go up in this area, as well as in education, which is interesting from some of the things that you hear and read. But about 30% of it goes to healthcare, and healthcare includes the Department of Human Services, Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse, and the Oklahoma Healthcare Authority. And then the third largest grouping is public safety. About 8.5% goes to public safety. That's the Department of Public Safety and the Department of Corrections. But those are the biggest portions of how the legislature spends the money that is available in general revenue. Any questions so far? Okay. So let's take a look at the 10-year change. 10-year change in terms of the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse. We saw a 56.5% increase since FY19 to FY18. We also saw a large increase to the Department of Human Services. Some of that has to do with the Pinnacle Plan. You might have remember in 2012 and 2013 there was a few bills that dealt with what we call the Pinnacle Plan, trying to put more money into the Department of Human Services. The third largest increase was the Oklahoma Healthcare Authority. We saw an increase of about 22% to the Healthcare Authority. Department of Public Safety, we saw a decrease of about 1.8 over the last 10 years. We did see a decrease from 2009, which was one of the highest years, to 2018. And we saw about a 3.29% decrease in the amount that was actually appropriated by the legislature. We also saw a slight decrease in the Department of Corrections. The interesting ones are on the far right. The Department of Transportation saw a little over a 25% reduction in the amount of money that they actually receive. The Regents for Higher Education saw a reduction of about 26%. 17% of that was actually in FY17, not this year, 2 years ago. And then we saw a significant decrease, and the largest decrease was the Department of Career Tech at about 30%. All right, now this is an interesting one that we put together, and it's all this information, by the way, has been retrieved from either the Oklahoma Tax Commission or the Department of Education itself. So basically what we wanted to do is take a look at the overall money and the overall expenditure by our in terms of education from 2007 to 2016. So the bottom portion here, and you can see that's where the state money is, the light blue or the turquoise. We've seen since 2007, and here in 2009 we saw a reduction, which is why 10 years was showing a slight reduction to the Department of Education. But in 2007 and 2008, you'll hear referred to the highest amount of money that was actually given to Department of given was in 2008 when we had natural gas prices at 13 or 14 bucks. But we've seen since 2007 basically a flat state portion of money. We've also seen just a slight increase in federal money. If you look at federal money in 2007 was $637 million. In 2016, it's only $695 million from the feds. We did see a significant increase in federal dollars from 2009 to 2011, and that was actually where most of the stimulus dollars came from, was right in there, and that's why you see the orange portion increase between 2009 and 2011. And we offset, or we basically knew that money was going to those programs, so we shifted monies around, which is also why you saw a decrease in the state portion, trying to keep them at a level funding. So the red and the blue are basically the local millages, the ad valorem taxes that education receives. And since 2007, just to give you an idea, in local millages, this is from the Department of Education. Local millages have gone up from 1.67 in 2007 to approximately 2.46. So the overall number today is $6 billion that the state, federal, and local actually contributes to education in the state of Oklahoma. Just to give you a sense, though, our average, our per pupil expenditure did decrease by 13%, and that's primarily due to the fact that we've seen a significant growth in our students. And we also, but some of the interesting things that we gleaned from the Department of Education, student growth was up 8.4%, which is pretty good growth in that time frame. Oklahoma's population grew by about 8%. We also saw the school district revenues, if you actually look at the total in 2007 to the total in 2016, grew about 18.6%. And one of the questions we've received as we've given this presentation a few times is, what about administration? How much did it grow? And these numbers come from the Department of Education. But from 2007 to 2016, administration grew by approximately 22.6%. All right, any questions on this slide? All right, here in terms of those is somewhere in the vicinity of $3 billion. Right now, the legislature doesn't have the ability to appropriate those funds. Past legislators basically decided that these were appropriate and are places that we should invest. But the legislature always has an opportunity, and we have seen it through what they used to call the OLAP program, and now it's called Oklahoma's Promise. That used to be off the top. It is no longer. You can roll off the top out of this process. Any questions on off the tops? Okay. Historic look at revenue and expenditures. So, in 2016, governmental revenues, where is our money coming from? Federal grants make up approximately $6.7 billion. It's the biggest portion, about 40%. Income tax makes up about $3 billion, 17.3. And that's actually at about $3 billion today. The third biggest is sales tax revenue. The state of Oklahoma, just like the city, receives, depends on what you vote for, but the state of Oklahoma basically receives 4.5 cents of all that sales tax that you pay. That is the 15% that you see there in red. Other revenues, other taxes, motor vehicle taxes is down there at 763, 4.5. Fuel taxes is about $424 million. Income taxes, corporate, is about $400 million. Gross production taxes is about $319 million. So total revenue is about $17 billion from all sources. But if you start to look at it, we also use the one-times and the recurring revenue. That's how you make up the difference. All right. What about 5 years ago? And I think this is interesting. And the white numbers are basically what it is today, to kind of give you a sense of where it was then. So federal monies 5 years ago in 2011, or now technically 6 years ago, was today actually the percentage has actually gone down in terms of federal. So as well as the amount of money. So in 2011 we were receiving about $7.5 billion, and today we receive about $6.7 billion from the federal government. Income tax, and this is something that I think is interesting and has been talked a lot about. We've lowered income tax rates in the state of Oklahoma. Maybe the pie was different or those kinds of things, but you have to look at the overall number, which income taxes in 2011 were about $600 million less than they are today, which I think is an interesting talking point. Also, we saw an increase in sales tax. Today, we've seen it's actually gone up about $350 million in terms of the state portion of the collection. So Oklahoma, from a revenue perspective, has actually done pretty well in the major sources of revenue. Okay, expenditures. How have expenditures for the state of Oklahoma changed? So let's look at 16, which is the current data we have. So right now, health services takes up about 32%, and we've already looked at this one a little bit in terms of expenditures. But I wanted to point back to it because now I'm going to show you what has actually happened since 2011 and where the shift has actually occurred. The shift, as you can see, healthcare has gone up. So in 2011, we saw about 29% of our overall expenditures was in the realm of healthcare. Today, we spend about 32%. The amount of money also has gone up. We spent about $4.8 billion in 2011. To today, we spend $5.7 billion in healthcare. So that's where a significant increase has actually occurred. The second biggest portion, of course, is education, and we've seen a reduction in the percentage. Now, that being said, we've also seen a reduction in the amount of money, but that doesn't necessarily come from the state of Oklahoma. A lot of it also comes from the federal government. So we've seen a reduction from state and from federal at about $200 million in terms of the overall spending to education. Third, social services. We basically see it holding steady. We also see administration holding steady for the most part, and capital outlay and some of the buildings that we're trying to upkeep is remaining very, very steady. The biggest shift is right over here between health and education. Any questions on any of that information?
Why would the healthcare go up so much?
Well, the cost of, we've seen it on our individual bill. It's the cost of healthcare. And just like you receive notices that your health care will go up by a certain percentage, the state of Oklahoma also has a plan that continues to go up, and they pay for their employees, so it ends up increasing significantly each and every year. And we're seeing that in the budget. If we go back 5 years, I guarantee you're going to see education is holding pretty steady, but all the other agencies are taking significant hits because of an increase in the overall budget of healthcare. And that's where the biggest challenge is going to be, even going forward with what's happening in Washington D.C. and the try to repeal the ACA. So we'll see how that develops as we come along. But the answer to your question is healthcare costs have just gone up since 2011. Good question. Okay, we hear this question all the time, and there are a few things that we point to, and we continue to flesh this out. Is it a revenue or a spending problem? What is the real issue here? So basically, this is as a state government employment as a percentage of the total employment, and we see that has basically remained the same. Total state expenditures have continued to rise since 2007. Now, we've seen 14, 15, a flat for the most part, but it's interesting to see how the percentage of employment was far greater in 2007, but as the budgetary number started to level off, the percentage started to catch up with the overall the red line, which is the total expenditure that actually occurred. So I think that's interesting to look at from a 10 to 12 year perspective as you look at total employment in our state. So where does Oklahoma rank in terms of the percentage of total employment? And if you look at the orange is actually the states that surround Oklahoma. So if you look at New Mexico, they rank 4th in terms of a percentage. So a lot of people in New Mexico actually work for the government. And then it goes all the way down to Texas, which is 38th. Those are in our region. And the percentage of overall employment there is somewhere in the vicinity of 3.37. So Oklahoma ranks 16th in terms of overall employment. We've stayed pretty consistent. If you refer back to the slide before. We stayed pretty consistent in about that 5.1, 5.2, depending on the year, and it's still that way. Now, in the last few years, we have seen a little bit of a reduction in state employees, but not a significant reduction. We have seen some agencies go way up, and we've seen some agencies go way down. And now that can be part of a shift in terms of what the agency is actually dealing with. But that is, so right now we rank 16th in terms of percentage of employment for government. Okay, so here's another interesting slide. This is looking at Medicaid enrollees and what has actually happened, and this is referring back to what we've seen in terms of the overall expenditure by the state of Oklahoma and how healthcare is starting to take up a larger portion of our expenditures. So in 2007, we had somewhere in the vicinity of 750,000 people on Medicaid. Our expenditures were somewhere in the vicinity of about $3.5 billion. As we see the years go on, 2010, 2011, we saw a significant increase, 12, 13. Now, since then, we've started to see a level off, but we saw a tremendous increase from 2007 to 14 in our expenditures in terms of Medicaid. We also saw a tremendous increase of enrollees, and that is primarily due to the ACA. But that is affecting the budget, and one of the issues and things that our state legislators, our governor, are having to look at when trying to craft a budget for FY18 and then even looking into FY19. Even though FY19, the first month, we saw tremendous increase. I think that they saw a $22.5 million carryover over and above what they actually estimated. We're seeing the economy really have an uptick. But that being said, things can always change. Policy can always change that. And a lot of times we've seen in the past, rhetoric and discussions can also hinder investment and hinder investment in our state. So we'll see how this special session continues to shape up. We will also see how this budget continues to shape up. But as of now, they are still trying to come up with an agreement between all three legs of the three-legged stool: the governor, the Senate, and the House. All right, that is our presentation on the budget. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about what the state of Oklahoma is having to deal with. At this point, there are a lot of things that are being discussed in special session. There were 198 bills that were filed. To give you a sense, in the 2005 and the 2013 special session that I actually participated in, there was one bill filed in 2005, and there were 12 bills filed in 2013, and today we have between 197 bills were filed during this special session. A lot of ideas on how to fix it. Each legislator, as long as they stay within the governor's call, which there were a few of the specific points that were pretty broad, which allowed for legislators. In the past, I've seen very specific calls to go to special session. Good question. This one was a little bit more broad, and anytime you're dealing with a budget, instead of specific policy, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to limit those bills to 12 bills, because general appropriations for specific agencies were affected. So each one of those agencies is going to need their own specific to avoid certain things. So there are going to need more bills, but it was interesting to me that 197 bills were actually filed.
A lot of discussion on the gross production tax with the Democrats wanting the 7%. Yeah. I don't know if I'm asking Mike Jackson or the state chamber the question, but where does it lie with the chamber? Their thoughts on it, because the Democrats come across 7% will answer all of our questions in the budget, and Republicans are like, it won't do a whole lot what you think it's going to do.
Well, So a little bit of a history, and thank you for the question. Gross production tax. I will give our policy position on gross production tax, and we are supportive of keeping it at 2%. In 2014, the Oklahoma legislature actually did raise it from 1% to 2%. I was there at the time, and I was getting a lot of pressure on the no side because it would be an increase in taxes. And I think it's interesting how the discussion, either from a social media perspective or from the legislative and others, has shifted in the course of 3 years, which seems like a long time at this point. But we do support keeping it 2%. We think, and we are now starting to see the benefit, and we saw the benefit too in 2014, but with long laterals now being in place, allowing for some of the Oklahoma Corporation Commission to come up with rules to regulate those longer drilling practices. We're seeing a lot of activity in the scoop and the stack. And what we don't want to do is we don't want to discourage investment. At the same time, we want to make sure that our schools, our essential services are adequately funded. But we would encourage, and I believe that we have policy specifically stating that when you look at revenue sources, make sure you're doing it from a broad perspective, not just pointing at one industry. And a lot of times we do point, or the legislature does point at one specific industry, whether it be wind, whether it be oil and gas, whether it be those types of things. If you look at a more broad-based approach and look at structural deficiencies, it does tend to give you a longer solution to structural problems that we have in the state.
Would it be a big hit to the energy companies if it was 7%?
Okay, so that's a complicated question to ask, but to answer. But it would definitely affect their drilling practices, I'm sure. Having talked to many of our members, as well as those that aren't our members, and just looking at the past things that have occurred, anytime you have natural resource in your state, whether it be solar, whether it be oil and natural gas, whether it be wind, whether it be whatever it might be, coal, which we do in the state of Oklahoma too. When that resource is available in another place, is just as easily mined in another place, to increase the tax won't probably end that from actually occurring, but each and every company, and anybody who's worked in a company, knows that there are capital decisions that are made in terms of where they drill. And if you have a capital acquisition in Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, Pennsylvania, which we've seen tremendous increases in those areas, and the tax structure may be the same, could be less, the rock is different, could be easier to drill, could be less easy to drill. All those things change your actual capital outlay. And I think that it's important that legislators, as well as the governor, keep that into the discussions, because what we don't want to see is, because of all the investment being made in Oklahoma, we saw a 22.5% increase in our collection as of August. We do not want to see, because of decisions that were made in special session or even in the regular session in FY8, either from the elimination of, to the reduction of at 25%, to the reduction in terms of the reimbursement portion of that. So their tax credits, whether it be rural housing, whether it be the film rebate program, are all being discussed right now. It depends on what, at the end of the day, they decide to do to fill the budget hole. Do they decide to cut agencies? Do they decide to increase revenue? It's going to be extremely difficult, with the House sitting at 72 and the Senate sitting at 39, to actually come up with votes to actually pass a 3/4 vote. So I don't see a tax increase actually occurring without Democrats saying yes. And at this point, Democrats have been unwilling to actually help them pass those types of revenues, which gets them to the exemptions piece and the tax credits, which increases the likelihood that that could be affected. Thank you for the question.
Education, you mentioned the administration levels have gone up. Is there a view on where the chamber stands on that as far as, I know that's a Department of Education type deal,
Sure.
but do you bring districts together? Do you close schools? And also with education was the, teacher pay raise.
Teacher pay raise.
It stands
Okay,
on
so
that.
I can talk about our specific policy. We have no policy on consolidation per se.
Okay.
I don't know of any group that would ever be for closing schools. There's a difference between administrative consolidation and closing schools. And then the teacher pay raise, the state chamber actually is for getting us to the regional average. But at the same time, there are things that we are very interested in terms of STEM, in terms of reforms that we would like to see kept, as well as furthered along to make sure that the product that we hire as businesses is at the level that we need it to be at, so that we can compete in an international level. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
And then, did you have another? Or I answered the teacher pay raise. Yeah.
Okay, I got to ask for my county commissioners because
Sure.
I hear it every single time I go to the county commissioner meeting. ODOT, the funding's been taken away, and they're not real excited about the CED, the Central or Circuit Engineering District. They just think it's another form of government, more money going back.
Yeah.
I hear obviously the state has their views on that, and they have put it in place where the county commissioners want their money and spend it because they know how to spend their money and where to spend the money. How does that fall with the state chamber? Because I know it's a big deal.
Our president and CEO, Fred Morgan, does a fantastic job. He's been at the chamber since 2010. He was actually my mentor in the House of Representatives, so I've known him for a little while now, ever since he was the minority leader in the House. But as you go through that process, it is difficult because you have differing opinions in a lot of different areas. You have higher ed institutions that are part of the chamber. You have oil and gas companies. You have wind companies. You have all those different entities. We tend to look at it from the holistic business perspective. Let's see how does the state of Oklahoma, and you see the pin on my lapel. I am going to put a little plug in for OK 2030. The chamber is embarking on a process right now of actually getting input into what we want Oklahoma to look like in the year 2030. It's extremely difficult process. It's an extremely intensive process trying to figure out what we want our schools to look like, what we want our roads to look like, what do we want our airports to look like, what do we want our governance to look like. And that is also due to the way that we are set up. In Texas, in Kansas, in other places, ad valorem dollars can go to the state of Oklahoma. We have a constitutional prohibition of ad valorem going to the state of Oklahoma, so all of our revenue increase and all of our revenue stream comes from sales tax, comes from income tax, and those types of things. So it differs in terms of the overall mix. And one of the things I will say, to be fair to education, I don't want to not be fair, but ad valorem dollars, even though I said they went up, they can't spend them on everything. So there are prohibitions in terms of how they can spend those dollars as well, where in other states they might not be. But our percentage, from a percentage perspective, going to those two groups is pretty high as compared to other states.